Bright lines of sunset shone through the closed blinds and across the hospital bed's clean sheets. A few rays passed through the saline bag in watery waves on the tile floor. Carl Duncan lost himself in this sight, and it evoked many fond memories. After all, it was the mystery of the ocean waves that brought him together with his closest friend, the man who now wasted away in that sterile room. In his last words of sound mind, he had asked Carl to hold his hand. Carl was the only person he had left in the world, and he wanted him nearby until the end. So, he spent every day for the past month at his friend's side, hand in hand, even as he lost the ability to speak. "I guess this is the end of the road, eh, Arnie?" he bleakly chuckled, stifling a cough of his own. He had felt a bit under the weather himself lately, but he didn't mind. They had been through hard times together before. Why not sickness, too? Still, he hoped the nurses wouldn't notice, or they might not have allowed him to stay. Arnold Ellis, world-class deep-sea diver, esteemed oceanographer, self-made adventurer, and Carl's best friend in this world. They had spent 20 years traveling the globe and scouring the blue deep for its wonders. 20 years making their mark on the study of sea life. He would have been mortified to think that it would end this way, an invalid waiting for death in the ICU of some hospital in some foreign land he'd never called home. "Excuse me, Mr. Duncan?" A soft voice spoke from the half-open door. "Visiting hours have ended, I'm afraid." Carl rose to his feet without reply, and the stiffness of the past hours creaked in his joints. He sighed and patted the back of Arnold's hand. "I'll see you tomorrow, Arnie. Get some rest, okay?" Days were hell for Arnold. He struggled to breathe, felt too weak to move or speak. He found it hard to think, or even remember where he was. He was a prisoner in his own body. Still, nights were so much worse. At night, it spoke to him. A great serpent of the deep. A belt of a shadow too long to be real, and its eyes were burning coals in the dark. He remembered, as he did every night, his dive into those uncommonly cold waters. No life or color, just the old blocks and bricks of a forgotten place. He remembered the massive stone face of the Colossus as it emerged from the murky haze, the ancient likeness of a king lost to the ages. And there, it waited for him, coiled about the shoulders of a silent giant, staring into his soul. "Your time dwindles. The end is near." That's what it said to him. The endless snake that spoke without words. It left Arnold to contemplate his approaching doom, and he wandered abyss for days in quiet terror. This would be his fate, this hollow oblivion, if he did not seize his last chance. "Do not fail me." The serpent hissed its furious impatience, and it stole the air from his lungs. The sensation of drowning consumed him. He nearly choked before he surfaced again in the unconsoling light of wakefulness, and his old friend greeted him there, hand in hand for another day. Carl watched as Arnold's eyes fluttered open. He was happy to see him awake, despite the look of confusion and fear he so often wore those days. At least he'd know a friendly face was by his side again. Or so he hoped. "Hey, morning, bud," he cheerfully greeted. He expected no response, but the nurses said it was good for him to hear a familiar voice. Carl spent most of his time talking, sometimes about nothing in particular, and Arnold would listen. Sorry for the clammy hand, he laughed. I think I caught some kind of bug. Catching a cold in the hospital. Who'd have thunk it, huh? Arnold huffed in response. Maybe a weak attempt at laughter. Carl nodded with a smile. Little reactions like that gave him hope. You remember when we first met? That run-down watering hole, that E1 urinal in 49? You got pissed drunk and tried to chat up that sailor's girl, going on and on about Jacques Cousteau and that film he shot. Her date looked like he was ready to clean your clock. He laughed. You passed out, and I helped you back to your room. Damn near had to drag you. Arnold's lip twitched into a half-smile. Yeah, crazy, right? I heard you tell her about your plans to travel the world, all the things you wanted to see. It sounded great. So I was the one to take you out on my boat for the dive that Sunday. You said you'd have gone the next morning if it weren't for the hangover, and I told you to feel lucky that sailor didn't break your legs and postpone it till next month. Carl laughed as hard as his lungs would allow, but his worsening cough cut it short. With a dry wheeze, he caught his breath and continued. We spent the rest of that day out on the water with cold beers and nowhere else to be, and I think you told me just about every story you had to tell. That's when I made up my mind. I wanted to see what you saw. Nothing was keeping me in that small harbor town anyway. You said you'd teach me to dive, and my boat wound up sailing us from port to port for the better of 8 years. Carl looked to Arnold, and his nostalgic reverie turned to disappointment. He'd stopped listening, instead tightly clutching the pendant around his neck and blankly staring at the ceiling. This wasn't the first time he'd seen Arnold this way. In fact, it was something he'd done every so often before the sickness took over. His obsession with that necklace was perhaps the last mystery he withheld over the years. A mystery to which Carl had never grown quite accustomed. Admittedly, it was a beautiful thing. A solid gold medallion shaped like a snake encircling a red jasper stone. Simple, but elegant, and in excellent condition from all the care he'd given it. Arnold said he found it on a dive at Abukir Bay during his trip to Egypt the year before they met, but he wouldn't say much more. That was one story he kept to himself. The rest of the visit passed in silence. Carl never had much to say when Arnold fell into that trance of his, especially when he was uncertain that he could still hear his voice. Still, he spent every last hour he could in that room, even as his own fever grew, as he began to nod off and wish for the shelter of his own bed. Loyalty to his friend mattered more than anything to him. So, as always, he held his hand till the nurse sent him on his way, leaving Arnold to another restless night. The serpent awaited Arnold in the deep, and he arrived once more to the stoic face of the Colossus. It slithered from boundless shadows into the ocean floor, circling a shallow grave at the giant's feet. And that was where his nightmare began. So many. Remember my gift. At the serpent's behest, a memory manifested before him. He watched from afar as his younger self, decades ago and clear as yesterday, moved aside the stone slab covering the grave. There, from beneath a knot of rotted linens, a dead and gnarled hand jutted forth like a beacon. In the shriveled curl of its grip, he could see a small glint of gold pierce the darkness. As his younger self took the pendant in hand and stared at it with an unspoiled fascination, Arnold reached out and tried to warn of its dangers. But he couldn't stop what had already come to pass. The great serpent hissed, the sound like a devilish grin, and it spoke to him in his mind. It spoke of a new pharaoh and the dawn of an age, crowned by the grace of Amun-Garib. To this young pharaoh, he sent his earthly avatar and the gift of his seal. Serve me, he said, and I will grant you life everlasting. For the sun god I cannot claim in the land of the dead. Give me his light and life, and your rule shall be eternal. For the lives of a few, I offer this in exchange." But the new king held faithful to Ra, beloved and feared as he was. It was by the grace of Ra that he was crowned, and so by the grace of Ra that he would reign. For his heresy, the serpent's mortal host met his death. The people buried him at the feet of this mighty statue, a guardian to ward him from the world of the living. My work meant for royalty has been passed on to you. Do my will, and the gift he turned away shall be yours." With that promise, a promise he'd heard time and time again in his dreams, the serpent released him from his sleep once more. The night had been unkind to Carl. His voice had grown hoarse and faint. His cough had become relentless, and his fever left him shivering in his chair. Still, come hell or high water, he stayed by Arnold's side. He couldn't speak. He could barely cling to consciousness, but he kept his promise. Even feeling as he did, he held his friend's hand. Perhaps, he thought with uncharacteristic cynicism, he was meant to die too. Perhaps this was their last journey together. Carl lifted his head wearily and noticed Arnold's straining face, his neck muscles tightening in agony. Arnold clasped his hand tightly, almost painfully, and he could feel his bones colliding uncomfortably in his grip. "Lord, Apep, my master." Arnold spoke in a dry rasp, his first words in weeks. In his delirious state, Carl was left speechless. He was uncertain if he'd imagined it, but heard it all the same. "Yes, take his light, and I will share with you my gift. Do my will, and live forever." The great serpent, Apep, coiled tighter around the giant's neck, constricting and crushing it with unrestrained strength. With a muffled crunch, the stone face fell away into rubble, victim to Apep's elation and fury. And Arnold submitted at last. He turned his head on the pillow and opened his bloodshot eyes, spilling tears for what he had done and for what he would now finish. He spoke in a little above a whisper. "I'm sorry, my friend, but I'm not ready to die. Not yet." Carl had no time or energy to react. He watched in terror as Arnold's eyes turned a deep shade of lime green over sickly yellow white, and his pupils formed the fine slits of a snake's gaze. He felt his hand go numb in Arnold's grip as the phantom serpent, for the last time, struck a vein with the venom of death. And in moments, it was over. For what felt like hours, Arnold stared from his pillow at the friend he betrayed. Carl's hair had turned white, his skin nearly translucent, and a trickle of black venom coursing through him spilled from the corner of his mouth. Arnold sighed with remorse. He could never be forgiven. He could never forgive himself, but the deed was done. His own hands had lost their wrinkles, and his skin glistened again with the pink vibrance of his youth. Apep had kept his word. He was young again, and he would live. "I'm sorry, Carl, and thank you for this. Thank you for everything. I promise I'll live long enough for the both of us," he said. At least, he thought, until his master demanded another.